Welcome to States of the World. In today's episode, we are going to talk about one of the most unstable countries in all of Europe, Italy. And right now, it's even crazier than usual, with a far-right prime minister, a failing economy, an immigration crisis, a culture war brewing, and extremism rising continually with every election. But before we can discuss all of that, we need to know how we got here in the first place. And to do that, let me take you on a little history lesson. The general starting point for Italy started with the Romans. There were several other groups of people living on the peninsula before, but the first real unification of the peninsula started with the Romans. This also marked the founding of one of the most significant cities in all of history, which is Rome. The real conquest of Italy by the Romans started with the founding of the Republic in 509 BC. The word republic is really misleading here, as they weren't as much of a republic in the modern sense of the word, but much more like a bunch of aristocrats that decided that a king wasn't really that cool. So instead, they decided to have consuls, which is a bit like in the modern terms a prime minister or president, but much more powerful. There were two, so they could check each other's powers, and they only had 1-year terms. This fast-paced exchange of power and the general glory-seeking attitude of the ancient world, combined with the inherent need for slaves to fuel their economy, led to a dangerous war machine, where the consuls would try to conquer as much land as possible in their 1 year of power. Eventually, this led them to encompassing the entirety of the Mediterranean and control land from Britain to modern-day Iran. In the middle of this conquest, they also decided to switch from a pseudo-republic to an empire with an emperor. But all empires must crumble, and as the empire grew, the instability grew with it, until the western half collapsed in 395 AD. Here the Italian peninsula split up and was continually controlled by foreign powers, either indirectly or directly, while Rome and its surrounding area was controlled by the Pope. This exchange of Italian control by foreign powers continued until about the 11th century, where the northern city-states emerged, like Venice, Milan, and Florence. These city-states began to experience enormous growth with flourishing trade, and created some of the more modern states for the period, where they weren't controlled by a king or an emperor, but rather political dynasties. Northern Italy, as a byproduct, became extremely developed and rich. With their newfound wealth, they also started the period known as the Renaissance, where art, science, architecture, and writing was encouraged and prosperous. Meanwhile, the south was still controlled by a slew of foreign states like the Normans, Spain, France, and Austria. This created a deep divide between the south and the north, which still has enormous political consequences for Italy today, where the south is in general a lot less developed and rich than the north. But all was not well in the north either. By the 17th century, the great wealth and trade the city-states had experienced began to dry up as new trade routes around the Mediterranean was discovered and used. This meant that now the north began to experience the same problems as the south, with several kingdoms and empires vying for control. This changed with the arrival of Napoleon and the revolutionary ideas of France in the 19th century. He took control of most of Italy and crowned himself king. But even when Napoleon was eventually defeated, and it seemed things would go back to normal, the revolutionary ideas still withheld. Italy at the time was controlled by several kingdoms that had different backings. The Kingdom of Naples, later the Kingdoms of Two Sicilies, the Austrian-controlled Eastern North, the Papacy, and the Kingdom of Piedmont and Savoy. The peninsula was beginning to grow tired of the continual overbearing control of foreign states and have begun to dream about a united Italy. And after a whole lot of fighting and war, finally in 1861, the king of Piedmont and Savoy, Victor Emmanuel II, was proclaimed King of Italy. While Italy was a kingdom, it should be noted that because of several revolts in the earlier days of Piedmont and Savoy's unification of the peninsula, Italy inherited several reforms and was a constitutional monarchy, which means that there were a Congress and election, but the elections were heavily constricted, and Congress held considerably lower power than the king. This was also a period which marked the start of the industrialization of Italy, but again it was mostly the northern part of Italy which experienced this growth, while the south was overpopulated and didn't get industrialized as much, so it remained mostly agricultural. This led to mass migration away from southern Italy and gave rise to the mafia that controlled the southern population with an iron fist. This immigration became so bad that now there is so many people with Italian heritage in the US that they call themselves a minority in the same vein as Hispanic, African Americans, and Asians.
Mayor of Los Angeles will be either an African American woman or a white man.
I'm Italian. That's Latin.
The new Kingdom of Italy became fond of the cool new trend of colonialism. They took control of Libya and had multiple grueling wars with the Abyssinians, modern-day Ethiopia. Here they even lost to the African power and had a real hard time getting control over the territory, even having to resort to using a little war crime known as mustard gas. In the First World War, Italy joined the Entente powers that included the USA, the United Kingdom, France, and Japan, against the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, even though they already had an alliance with Germany at the time, so they were a little bit of a snake. In the war, they mostly fought against an old enemy in Austria-Hungary, but like every other front in World War I, except Russia, the front really didn't move. But the humans' lives did, and in the end, Italy ended up with losing 1,240,000 men in the fighting. In the peace treaty, Italy expected a lot, because they were promised a lot from the British Empire, like Dalmatia and Albania. But as we all know, the British loved their lies, and Italy really didn't gain much. The only gain was some territory in northern Italy and a few cities and islands. This enraged the Italians and made the king extremely unpopular, because, he signed the treaty. It got declared that the victory of World War I was a mutilated victory, which really stuck, especially for a bald Italian man and several other populist and extremist groups, both from the left and the right. But it was especially the left that was beginning to win more and more votes and in turn got more and more power. This led to the king and the right wing to give more and more support to a new right-wing party known as the Fascists, with Benito Mussolini at the helm. In 1922, Mussolini took advantage of a general worker strike and began his march on Rome. Here he called for the Fascists to gain political power or the king to face a coup. It so happened at the time that the prime minister was from the Socialist Party and didn't really like the monarchy. So when Victor Emmanuel heard that Mussolini said that he wanted to depose the socialist prime minister Luigi Facta and install himself as prime minister, he thought long and hard about it for about 2 seconds and decided that Mussolini had some great points. So Mussolini became the prime minister and later dictator and got Italy into another world war. He dreamt of returning Italy to the glory days of the Roman Empire, but lost almost every single battle. Got roasted by Churchill and died to his own people and hanged from a lamppost. Even with the fascists being thoroughly humiliated in World War II, they had a lingering effect, and fascism is still well and alive in modern-day Italy. After Mussolini's death and the end of World War II, Italy finally became a real democracy, and its constitution was mainly drafted by the two leading parties at the time, the Christian Democrats and the Communists, with the Christian Democrats representing the right and the Communists representing the left. These parties were also heavily represented in the Italian constitution, with the Christian Democrats making Catholicism the state religion and the Communists getting comprehensive protections for the Italian citizens and workers. But the primary focus of this new constitution was on anti-fascism and the prevention of another autocratic regime from getting to power ever again. The most glaring change was that the most powerful position was split into two, the president and the prime minister. The president is mainly a ceremonial figure and is elected by the two chambers, the Chambers of Deputies and the Senate. But the president still holds some significant power, like being the leader of the judicial branch and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The prime minister is like most other European leaders' positions. His primary function is the leader of the executive branch and is supported by a majority coalition in both the deputies and the Senate. These two parties would also define politics in Italy for the next 40 years. The Christian Democrats won the first election with only a small lead over the Communist Party, both getting around a third of the vote. This lead widened and the Christian Democrats began to dominate the government. In the next 40 years, the Christian Democrats was in control of the prime minister position and was in coalition with a multitude of different political parties. The primary function of all of these was to ensure that the communists never came to power. This was not to say that the communists disappeared. It was still for 40 years the primary opposition party for the Christian Democrats and was for all of it the largest democratically elected communist party in all of Europe. But a big change happened in 1992 called Manipolit, which in English can be translated to clean hands, which funnily enough no politician in Italy at the time had. It was a corruption scandal in which up to 5,000 public figures and politicians came under investigation for corruption. These charges include bribes to Italian politicians for up to $4 billion and a slew of political bribes to local voters and officials. The scandal implicated major political players from both major parties, and more than half of the political parliament was under investigation, and some even committed suicide because of the shame this incident caused them. The support for the Christian Democrats plummeted and in 1994 dissolved into a whole lot of different political parties because of the scandal, like the Italian People's Party and the Christian Democrat Center. This also happened to the communists and lost most, or if not all, of their support, even with a surge of support in the 1992 elections. This made the whole political scene a mess and right up for the taking, maybe even for a questionable man that appeared on TV a lot, was charismatic and even slightly orange. No, not that guy. This guy, Silvio Berlusconi. Before his passing, he was the 5th richest man in Italy. He came into the political scene with a bang as his new political party called Forza Italia. Through his 3 different national TV channels, he gained a huge advantage in the snap election of 1994 and gained a substantial amount of the vote. He even managed to form government with the National League, who was self-proclaimed neo-fascist, and the separatist party called Lega Nord, which main political selling point was for northern Italy to separate from mainland Italy, or at least something very close to that. His government was short-lived though, when Lega Nord withdrew their support a year later, a move they were extremely fond of, as we will see later.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in
Berlusconi's failed government gave rise to the central-left coalition that lasted surprisingly long, a whole 2 years. Congratulations to Romano Prodi, the prime minister of this coalition, for being the 3rd longest lasting government in power in modern Italy. The left stayed in power just with a new coalition with Massimo D'Alema as the prime minister, after the coalition fell surprisingly after 2 years. They swapped prime ministers again, but by then the elections was only a year away. And guess what, baby? Berlusconi is back, stronger than ever, more corrupt than ever, and even more orange. He dominated Italian politics from the period of 2001 to 2011, with only a short stint as opposition in 2006 to 2008. Period of dominance, he joined the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, which was considered highly controversial because of Act 11 in the Constitution, which states that Italy is against all aggressive wars against other people's freedom and international disputes. Other than that, he passed several laws that was tough on crimes, but at the same time tried to give himself and his allies legal immunity. I wonder why he did that.
Foreshadowing as a narrative device.
He also passed several laws which suspiciously helped his own businesses in several ways. He also set up the Micronin Commission, whose job was to investigate KGB ties of the Italian left wing, his main opposition at the time, again highly controversial. In 2008, he furthered relations with Libya's dictator Mohammed el-Gaddafi, which again was highly controversial. But in 2009, he hit his highest point in controversy when he got himself involved in a prostitution scandal, which led to his divorce. Here he was accused of having close relationships with several underage girls, and multiple call girls came out against him and showed proof of transactions for sex. These sex parties he would hold would also be referred to as bunga bunga parties. He would, however, remain in office until 2011, where he resigned due to the Eurozone crisis, which basically was a crisis that involved multiple states like Greece, Ireland, and Italy, who couldn't pay back their government debt and exposed their heavy reliance on foreign investment to keep their country running, which is still a problem to this day. In 2008, his cabinet also got a new Minister of Youth, Giovanni Meloni of the National Alliance, later the Brothers of Italy, who will become important later. In 2013, Berlusconi was convicted of tax fraud, where he was to serve 4 years in prison, in which, through legal trickery, he served none and only had to do community service. It did mean, though, that he couldn't run for office for 6 years, which expelled him from the Senate. From 2011 to 2013, the government was run by a technocratic government led by technocrat Mario Monti. In the 2013 election, the central left won, and Enrico Letta became the prime minister. The interesting part of this election, though, was the emergence of a new anti-establishment force, the Five Star Movement, which became the clear third-party player in Italian politics. The left once again showed their inability to work together and have a government that lasted more than a couple of years, because in 2014, Enrico Letta lost support from the main left-wing party, the Democratic Party. Instead of an election being held, a new prime minister got assigned, Matteo Renzi. He was really fond of the third way, which combines right-wing economics with left-wing social issues, so basically a centrist. This period was also the start of the European migrant crisis, which Italy took the brunt force of. Here Italy took in 181,000 migrants, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, and while this number has lessened, is still, as in many other European countries, one of the main political issues of Italian politics today. Matteo Renzi served until 2016, but he did contribute quite a lot in the 2 years he was prime minister. He got a labor reform passed and got the parliament to recognize same-sex civil unions, which is not the same as same-sex marriage, which is still illegal in Italy. His downfall came when he got a little too big for his own boots. He tried to reform the Italian parliament, in which he proposed a bill that would severely limit the power of one of the two chambers, the Senate. Here they would no longer be able to hold no confidence votes, which has failed multiple Italian governments, and limit their voting power to only a few issues. The bill was heavily criticized for being poorly written, and when the public went out to vote for the bill, the public voted 59% against it, which prompted Renzi to hand in his resignation. His Minister of Finance, Paolo Savona, took over and held on to power until the 2018 election. The 2018 election saw the emergence of anti-establishment parties. The Five Star Movement saw a wave of support for the anti-EU, immigration and environment stance, and left-wing economic policies. The second party which saw an upswing in this election was Lega Nord, or League. The old separatist movement of northern Italy had undergone a transformation in recent years with Matteo Salvini at the helm. He transformed the party from a pretty niche party to the hallmark far-right party of Italy, with policies of strong immigration and an extreme anti-EU stance. Because these two parties was the biggest after the election and agreed a little bit on some issues, they decided to form a coalition and chose technocrat Giuseppe Conte as their candidate for Prime Minister, a quite unusual choice as he wasn't even a member of either party. This coalition was short-lived though, because after a European Parliament election in 2019, Lega Nord saw a surge in the polls. This prompted Salvini to think if he could trigger an election, he would win the election and become Prime Minister. He hastily withdrew from the coalition, but to his surprise, the Five Star Movement, which was not doing well in the polls, decided to find a new partner in the Democratic Party, a central left-leaning party. Still, the Prime Minister Conte, even as a technocrat, was beginning to gain popularity with the voters because of his legislation. Here he would do strict policies for illegal immigrants, which was beginning to become an easy way to get popular in Italy. But he would also do many other relatively positive received reforms, like a guaranteed minimum income, a constitutional reform to limit the number of members in both chambers, a lot of nationalization of industries like train, steel and airway industries. His short-lived rise would become his short-lived downfall though, when a little thing happened called COVID-19. Here he would implement one of the strictest lockdown measures in Europe, but Italy would still experience one of the worst death tolls of COVID with 190,000 deaths. He would also be criticized for being anti-democratic because of his use of a lot of prime ministerial degrees, which is just a decision that he can make, but the parliament doesn't get a say in it. This would lead to, in 2021, former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi's new party, Italia Viva, withdrawing their support from the government, and a new Prime Minister came in to save the day, a kind of national hero of Italy, Mario Draghi, or as he was nicknamed, Super Mario. He was the president of the European Central Bank during the Eurozone crisis, where he became famous for saying he would do whatever it takes to prevent the euro from failing. And because of his monetary policies, he would become known as the savior of the euro. The general consensus of Italian parties was positive, and a grand coalition was formed where every major party supported Mario Draghi, except for the Brothers of Italy, with Giorgia Meloni as their leader. See, I said she would become important later. Anyways, most parties loved Super Mario in the beginning, and a popular motto was formed: he saved the euro, now it's his time to save Italy. But it didn't go as planned, because apparently it's much easier to restructure, reform and control the entirety of the EU's monetary policy than to make Italian politicians not go bananas for 2 seconds. Already in 2022, 3 major parties would withdraw their support from the savior of Italy because of an economic stimulus package. The Five Star Movement, Forza Italia, Berlusconi's party, yep, he's back, and Lega Nord. The major critic of the stimulus package was the Five Star Movement, which said that the 23 billion euro stimulus package was simply not enough, and in a little over a year, Super Mario was forced to resign. This started the 2022 election. which would have record low voter turnout of 63%, the far-right party Brothers of Italy, and the far-right in general, was the major winners. The Brothers of Italy benefited hugely from their refusal to back Super Mario, and them becoming the only real opposition party. Now, before we talk about the new government, it's important to talk about some of the issues facing Italy right now, and then we can later talk about the different political parties and their solutions. The Italian economy has become famous for being one of the worst in the major countries of the EU, and there is a good reason for that. First of all, the GDP growth of Italy is pretty decent, bouncing back from a really bad 2020, where they had a negative GDP growth of minus 9%, to a growth of 6.7% in 2021. And in 2022, they also had a decent to good year for European standards, with a growth rate of 3.7%, to then now being projected to have a growth rate of around 1.2% in 2023. This is not really that worrying, and is following the general trends across all of Europe. But as most people that follow even a little bit of economics knows, GDP growth never tells the full story. It also has a positive trade balance, which means they sell more products than they buy, which usually means economic growth. Their main industries that are doing good is fashion, with companies like Armani, Fendi, Prada and Versace, though it should be noted that many of these companies have been bought by foreign companies, or at least the foreign companies hold a large amount of the shares. The other industries that are doing good are machinery, food, automotive parts, and pharmaceuticals. In terms of inflation, they have hit a pretty high number over the last year, with an inflation rate going up to around 11.8%, before going back down to around 7.6%. This is of course bad, but not too worrying, as countries like Brazil in the 1960s and 70s have had a good economic growth rate with around an inflation rate of 6%. The average income in Italy is around 2,500 euros per month, or around 44,000 euros per year. It has an unemployment rate of around 7.8%, which is pretty high for Western European standards. But it should be noted that all of this heavily varies from whatever part of Italy you are in, as the average income in the northern part of Italy is about 127% of the average European income, and in the south it gets as low as only 56% of the average European income. The reason for this variance is a great source of debate among researchers, but it's generally believed by professors like Francis Fukuyama in his book Origin of Political Order and Decay that the source of this divide is historical. He points out that the North in general got to industrialize a lot earlier, while the South was interlocked by politics of different European powers, which led to the South staying largely agricultural throughout most of its history. This trend can also be seen today, as most of the industry in Italy is in the North. This has caused a lot of friction in Italy between the North and the South, and spawned political parties like Lega Nord, who originally was a party for the separatist movement for the North. Even with these things being a huge economic problem, for Italy it's not the biggest. Clearly the biggest problem for Italy is its debt. Right now, Italy's debt to GDP ratio is at 140%, which means that its debt is larger than their entire economy. This debt is largely from the EU, who constantly have to keep sending Italy massive government bonds with very low interest rates, so they don't explode like Greece in the early 2010s. This fact has made many economics call Italy a country being kept alive with a respirator, or a country on borrowed time. This is largely because Italy can't hold up its economy on its own. This is worsened by the fact that this debt potentially has to be paid back at some point. And while this debt is bad, it's not at the end of the world for one reason only, precisely because its source is largely from the EU. The EU do not have any real incentive to shut down the respirator, so to speak, because that would have large consequences for the rest of the European nations that trade heavily with Italy. This has led EU to keep sending massive government bonds, even when they know that it's not going to get paid back anytime soon. This has caused a lot of headaches for the populist parties of Italy, like the Five Star Movement, Lega Nord, and the Brothers of Italy, because the EU is a very easy player to point the finger at for all Italy's economic problems when you're on the outside, but when you're running the country and realize the EU is the only thing that is holding your country up, it becomes a lot harder to antagonize them. This is the most prominent economic issue for Italy right now. Italy must find a way to decrease their government spending or increase Italy's economic output to lower their national debt. But this is a lot harder than it seems. They can't lower their spending too much, otherwise the quality of life in Italy will significantly worsen. At the same time, they can't really increase the government spending too much, otherwise it may cause the whole economy to explode. I acknowledge that it's extremely hard to find a balance here, and I frankly would have no idea where to start. Now let's talk about the most popular issue in Italy, and like many other European countries, it's immigration. The exact number of immigrants coming to Italy is difficult to determine, largely because of the unaccounted for illegal migrants that usually come by boat. But in 2020, about 34,000 migrants arrived in Italy. In 2021, 76,000, and in 2022, 105,000. This is a sharp decrease in migrants compared to the largest year of migrants arriving in Italy, which was 2016, where 181,000 migrants arrived. In total, there is about 5.8 million immigrants in Italy, making up about 10% of their population. It should be noted, however, that most of these immigrants are from other European countries like Romania and Albania. The number of migrants are undoubtedly rising in recent years, coupled with many Ukrainian immigrants numbering about 170,000. It's without a doubt a big challenge for a country with a struggling economy like Italy. It should also be noted that Italy is bearing the brunt of the immigrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, with other European countries like Spain and Turkey. That is largely because Italy is one of the main entry points for migrants. This means that Italy has taken in a lot more immigrants than most European countries. This is worsened by the fact that the rest of Europe have not been kind to Italy, with not taking their own share of the migrants coming from Muslim or African nations. This has made immigrants an easy target, especially for right-wing politicians like Salvini and Meloni. They point to immigrants as one of the main reasons for a lot of Italy's problems. And I'm not here to say that immigration is easy or doesn't cost money, but I would also like to show a different side to this argument. In 2021, immigrants contributed 9% to the annual GDP of Italy, about the same as the portion of the population. This has fallen from 2013, where immigrants contributed 12% and was only 7.4% of the population. This is not surprising when a lot of the new immigrants are coming from poorer countries and in general have a worse education. But this still shows that first of all, immigration can undoubtedly help the economy of Italy if Italy actually puts the effort into integrating them. And second, it shows that immigrants in general are not worsening Italy's situation by much when they contribute about as much as their population size to the economy. Another reason why immigration might be the key to solving some of Italy's issues is in the demographics. In 2018, 157,000 Italians migrated away from Italy, most of them quite young. This, coupled with Italy's population decreasing by 0.6% annually and the Italian population growing older, shows that in the future, Italy needs new workers, if they want to keep their standard of living, of course. Of course, this could also just be done with Italians having more kids, but that is not something you really want to force your people to do. Then you must ask yourself, what is the easiest way to get new workers into your wealthy country? Immigration. If the integration of these immigrants is done correctly, It could help ease the burden of young Italians that have to care for a large aging population. There could of course also be other solutions, like hoping automation comes a long way in the next 30 years and solves the need for a large workforce, but that it really isn't something you want to bank on. But for now, let's move on from immigration and talk about the foundation of Italian society, the state. In my personal opinion, corruption and the government is the most fundamental issues with Italy as a whole, and a lot of other issues in Italy stems from this. But let's start with corruption and clientelism. Clientelism is a huge problem in Italy and is heavily linked with corruption. First of all, we need a definition. Clientelism is the good or services for political services. Typically, this exchange is characterized as individualistic and not universal. For example, clientelism could go like this. A political figure from a national or local political party goes to an influential member of society. This could either be in a community or more broad, like a business owner. Let's say in this example, it's a highly respected member of a local community. The political figure wants votes and support, but wants it guaranteed and not based on a broad political platform. So, this political figure goes to the highly respected member and gives them an offer. They will give them 200,000 tax-free euros, a position in the local government with a great wage, and exempt them from taxes as long as they stay in office. In return, the highly respected member promises a certain number of votes for this political candidate in his community. They both agree, and now the highly respected member needs to secure a certain number of votes. So he goes to his community and says they will pay them a certain amount of money, and the only thing they have to do is vote for this candidate. Now it's voting day, and a certain community suddenly unanimously vote for a certain political candidate. Wow, what an unexpected surprise! Now, why is this a problem, and why is clientelism relevant in Italy? You see, it's a problem because democracy in general works like this. A party or candidate proposes changes. Voters can then look at the candidates and say this person's platform benefits me the most, or this guy is the one I agree with the most, and votes with them. Of course, this doesn't always happen in practice, but it's the principle that upholds democracy as a working system. Now, clientelism throws a wrench in this plan, because while a little community taking money and voting unanimously for a candidate is not a problem on the national scale, it becomes a problem if this becomes the norm on a national scale, because all of a sudden, voters are no longer voting universally for their best interest, but for who voters individually can get the most out of. This creates a political system where politicians no longer need to push for changes or for voters' best interest, but instead only need to concentrate on how many voters they can bribe, and in the end this creates a rotten society that is no longer advancing forward. Now, why is this relevant to Italy? You may have guessed it, but it's because Italy is riddled with clientelism. The exact numbers are extremely difficult to find, but historically it has a higher prominence in the south rather than the north of Italy. Social scientists have a multitude of reasons for this, but there is again a general consensus that it's rooted in history. As mentioned, the South was for a long time ruled by foreign powers. This has made Southern Italians worried about authority and government. This has also led to a large percentage of Italians not paying taxes. So when a politician promises something, it's a lot less guaranteed than someone offering a direct payment. Combined with the South being in general a lot poorer, it has made the perfect storm for clientelism to take over. But the bribes and corruption in Italy doesn't just go one way, and the other way is even more prominent in the world as a whole: rich people bribing politicians. A lot of politicians in Italy has been taking bribes either in the normal legal way, through lobbyism, or under the table dealings. This is done so politicians can fill their pockets and the rich can control public policies, so they don't harm their businesses or whatever they are doing. This problem is worsened in Italy because of the unregulated nature of lobbyism in Italy. In a report called Lobbying and Democracy, representing interest in Italy, it showed just how bad lobbyism is regulated in Italy. Overall, the report scored Italy in 3 categories: transparency, integrity, and equality of access. Here they scored abysmal in all 3 categories, with transparency being at 11%, integrity at 27%, and access being at 22% out of 100%. There have been several laws proposed to regulate the rampant lobbyism in Italy, actually 50 throughout the history of the Republic, but surprisingly, none have passed. This large-scale corruption has resulted in Italy being ranked by Transparency International as one of the most corrupt nations in Europe, with a score of 56 out of 100. Now let's talk a little bit about the government in Italy, which in many ways worsens this corruption and in general makes Italy a lot more unstable compared to other European nations. First of all, Italy is a democratic republic, meaning that it has a presidential head of state, which is currently a man called Sergio Mattarella. They get elected every 7 years and is elected by the parliament. What makes Italy different compared to other democratic republics like the United States or France is the limited power in the presidency. You can think of them more as a powerful King Charles II of the United Kingdom rather than a president. But the real power lies in the 2 chambers and the cabinet of ministers. Like many other European democracies, the legislative branch and the executive branch are heavily intertwined. Here, most of the ministers are usually politicians from the dominant coalition, and they work together a lot with the parliament. This means that the real checks and balances of the system comes mostly from the multiple political parties elected. The way these political parties get elected is through a system called proportional representation, and while there is some theory and details which complicate things, in general it works like this. A party that gets over 2% of the vote gets that amount of proportional seats in the parliament of the 2 chambers, the deputies and the senate. This can lead to a lot of political parties with a lot of different opinions. The chambers of deputies elect 400 members and the senate elect 200. This changed in 2020, where a national referendum lowered the number of seats in both chambers. So in a way, the Italian system is a mixed breed of the American democracy and the normal European democracy. A small side note, in the Senate there is something called Senators for Life, which, as the name suggests, is a senator that is elected for life. This includes former presidents of the Republic and people appointed by the president for their outstanding service to Italy by the way of social, science, artistic and literary fields. Currently there are 6 senators for life, ranging from former prime ministers to scientists to Holocaust survivors and activists. But the problem with the parliament and government system of Italy is the instability. As you can probably tell, a proportional voting system with 2 chambers can lead to a lot of problems. This is primarily because of no confidence votes, which is basically affirming that the current government has the backing of the parliament, where over half of the parliament have to vote in favor of the government. This has to happen in both chambers. So you can have a majority in the deputies, but if you're 1 vote short in the Senate, you are out of power. Currently there is 23 parties elected in the parliament, and usually a lot of parties form together to form a majority. This is completely normal and happens in most democratic systems, except the US. But this is also where the problem lies for Italy, because let's run through a completely hypothetical scenario. For example, the Prime Minister is holding a cabinet meeting and unfortunately gets into an argument with the Minister of Grace and Justice. Then the Prime Minister's shoemaker comes in with a fresh new pair of shoes for the Prime Minister. The Minister of Justice wants to get one over on the Prime Minister and tries on the Prime Minister's shoes while still arguing with the Prime Minister. This causes even more chaos, and the Prime Minister has taken this as a great sign of disrespect. The argument further devolves, and now the coalition is in chaos. This leads to your second in command to orchestrate a coup. Here a completely separate party suddenly withdraw support from the coalition, and now you're no longer prime minister, and the government have collapsed. And you don't have to worry about this hypothetical not being real, because it is. This happened in 1998 between the Prime Minister Romano Prodi and the Minister of Justice Giovanni Maria Flick, which led Massimo D'Alema to orchestrate a coup and the Communist Party to withdraw their support. And you know the craziest thing? Giovanni wasn't even a member of the Communist, he was independent. Of course, this is just a funny side note and not how every government in Italy collapses. But it's still a problem because it shows how fragile the government of Italy is. Since 1945, there have been 66 governments and 60 prime ministers in just 78 years. This roughly equates to a new government being formed every 13 months, which is absolutely crazy and should not happen. The primary reason for this is because in proportional democracy, you usually don't have the biggest majority, and when a bunch of different political parties with different interests have to go together, it can lead to arguments, and these arguments can often result in disaster, because even a small party can withdraw their support, and all of a sudden the coalition doesn't have the support of the parliament, and is forced to dissolve. This is worsened by the fact that the coalition have to constantly have a majority in two separate chambers at the same time, which is of course extremely difficult. Another reason for this constant change in government is some of the absurd checks the government have to go through just to pass a law. Like a lot of the time, the government need to hold a no confidence vote just for legislation to pass. So for example, if some legislation is against one of the supporting party's interests, it has an impossible choice to make. Either it must topple the government or support legislation that their voters don't want. This is of course all horrible, and no great change can come if the power changes hands every year, and this is mostly all of the greedy and petty politicians' fault. But there is something to be said about the Italian citizens' contribution to this problem as well. As we know, in 2019, Salvini withdrew his support from his coalition with the Five Star Movement, because Salvini's party, Lega Nord, looked great in the polls. He hoped to start a snap election that didn't happen. So what is the point in all of this? Well, normally in working democracies, when a party displays this kind of power-hungry and corrupted behavior, they lose support in a massive way. But Salvini's party, Lega Nord, didn't lose support after this stunt, and even gained in the polls, which shows that the Italian people do need to hold their politicians accountable, even when they're all acting like a monkey in a cage, which does happen very often. All of this combines into a very dysfunctional democracy, which can be seen in the Democratic Index, where they scored 6.69 out of 10, a really bad score for a European country, and rules them as a flawed democracy, which translates to the 34th most democratic country in the world, or the 4th least democratic country in all of Western Europe, only over Turkey, Cyprus and Belgium, who all have their own problems. But this year, they even lost to fucking Malta. Malta, one of the most notoriously corrupt nations in all of Europe. It's time to step it up, Italy. The primary concern for Italy should be to install faith in the government and make politicians accountable. There is a few ways of doing this. One of the ways this could be done is by removing the Senate. That way, the government doesn't need to constantly worry about holding a majority in two separate chambers. It is already difficult enough in other European nations that only have one chamber to hold a majority anyways, and is shown to still be able to hold their government accountable. Another thing that could be done would be to remove some of the checks and balances so the government can do their job easier and quicker. There is this misconception that the more checks and balances you have, the better it is for democracy and the people of your country, but that couldn't be further from the truth. If you have as many as Italy, as you can see, it can result in a slow, unstable and inefficient government that can't do their job properly. Instead, the state should have a nice balance of checks and balances, so they can still do their job effectively, but not in an undemocratic way. There's a lot of political points that I didn't talk about here that I will quickly go over. As in many other European nations, climate change is also a big topic of debate, but as it's not specifically about Italy as a whole, there isn't a lot to talk about. Just note that the topic exists and most political parties are committed to do something about it, just to varying degrees, where the left is usually more aggressive in their policies, while the right is taking a more conservative approach. The culture war has also been imported to Italy from the US. Here the ideas of wokeness, feminism, LGBT rights, and abortion are the main discussion points. In general, the politicians are more than happy to talk about them, because it's a lot easier to support or be against a group of people than it is to fix a disastrous economy or state. Abortion is legal in Italy, but doctors can object to give abortion surgery because of personal reasons. This has led to some states in Italy, like Molise, where 96% of all gynecologists object to carry out the surgery. That had led to some women having a real hard time getting one. The parties are generally split down the middle on this issue, where the left wants women to have the right to abortion, and the right generally wants to ban abortion. Of course, there is still some variance in this split, especially in the right, where some parties let their party members vote freely on social issues. As such, there isn't a completely clear divide. LGBT rights is also a big issue in Italy, and the main discussion point is gay marriage, because it's still illegal in Italy, while civil unions got legalized in 2014. This is likely an effect of the large cultural influence the Catholic Church still has in Italy, which have viewed being gay as a sin and marriage as holy. This has changed a little bit with Pope Francis going out multiple times and welcoming gay people into the Catholic Church. He is still iffy on gay marriage, but supports civil unions, and this is huge progress for gay people when the last two popes was heavily against the idea of gay people in general. Feminism in Italy, like most other countries, has almost lost all meaning, because especially the right has been calling every and anything feminism and made it one of their biggest enemies. This has meant that feminism in general has lost a lot of the value that it once possessed, and now is more of a buzzword for both sides of the political spectrum to rally their masses. In terms of equal pay though, Italy has one of the lowest in all of Europe, with only a 5% difference as a whole. There are still industries where this disparity is higher. Lastly, there is extremism. The interesting thing about Italy is that after World War II, its extremism was more generally on the left than the right. Of course, there were openly fascist parties, but until the 1990s, the biggest extremist party were the communists. This changed with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Clean Hands scandal that the communists got themselves involved in. They lost all of its support, and Marxism largely lost its steam in Italy. Now the most popular left-wing parties support social democracy, which is a central left ideology. Contrary to the left, the right-wing extremism really gained a footing in the 90s with Berlusconi's party Forza Italia that were a populist party. In the 2000s, it took a little dip, but in the 2010s, it really came back in a major way. Lega Nord and the Brothers of Italy began to be extremely large political players and even became potential coalition leaders. Another extremist party also got in the mix with the anti-establishment party, the Five Star Movement. This extremism has now hit its peak, with 3 of the 5 biggest parties being a form of extremist ideology, either far-right and populist or just populist. This also leads us to the current government, which is led by one of these populist far-right parties. The current dominant party in Italian politics, as said, is the Brothers of Italy, or FDL. They won 119 seats in the deputies and 65 in the Senate in the 2022 election. But nobody can really pinpoint the exact ideology of FDL. It has been described by outside observers as far-right, conservative, neo-fascist, and post-fascist. This is also supported by their own members, as the leading members call the FDL traditional conservative, while some of the lower-ranking members have openly declared themselves as fascist. This could stem from them being the spiritual successor of the National Alliance and Italian Social Movement, the 2 most prominent fascist parties in Italy since 1945. This is also shown in their logo, which sports a tricolor flame, which is a common fascist symbol in Italy. This fascist stigma is also extremely hard to get off when your Speaker of the Senate, Inganzo La Russa, is proudly showing off fascist memorabilia in an interview in 2018, and when you have run several of Mussolini's family members in election for your party. The party's general policies is an extremely strict immigration stance, and a EU-skeptic stance that changed from when they wanted to leave the EU. It has also embraced the culture war. Here they support traditional family values and is against abortion and gay marriage. But let's talk a little bit about their leader and Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. For their leader, it's not very different. She in general holds the same views as her party, but I will share some of her more controversial moments of her political career. She defended the laws Berlusconi passed to help his own businesses with the statement, "It is necessary to contextualize them. Those are laws that Silvio Berlusconi made for himself, but they are perfectly fair laws," which is a hilarious statement. Imagine Joe Biden passing a law that gave himself millions of dollars and saying that it's completely okay and good actually, because they were legal laws. Like, that's not the point. She is also a big fan of conspiracy theories, like the Great Replacement, which says that the immigration crisis of sub-Saharan Africa is planned and is trying to get rid of ethnic Italians. She also frequently criticizes George Soros and globalists, a dog whistle for Jews. This is usually combined with the Great Replacement theory, which some of its believers think that George Soros is the mastermind of, which is extremely funny. Like, what great plan is a 92-year-old billionaire gonna conduct when he probably can't even get out of bed himself? In 2019, she gave a speech where she said, "I am Giorgia, I am a mother, I am Italian, I am Christian." This wouldn't be special on its own, but this statement got remixed into a song that went viral in Italy, and I have to be honest, it's a banger.
Giorgia, sono una donna, sono una madre, sono cristiana. Giorgia, sono una donna, sono una madre, sono cristiana. Io sono Giorgia, sono una donna, sono una madre, sono cristiana. Giorgia, sono una donna, sono una madre, sono cristiana. È il gioco del pensiero.
In her youthful days, she praised Mussolini in a statement where she said, "A good politician in that everything he did for Italy, and is the best politician of the last 50 years," which, let's be honest, is a crazy statement to make. But in other news, she is also an avid fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and fantasy novels. She was even on stage singing with a far-right folk band, whose name I will not even try to pronounce. These far-right folk bands was really something I didn't need to know existed. But now I feel obligated to let you guys know as well, so I'm not alone in my suffering. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any videos of this great performance, so you just have to listen to this one a bit more.
È il gioco del pensiero unico. Ci devono togliere tutto quello che siamo, perché quando non avremo più un'identità e non avremo più radici, noi saremo privi di consapevolezza, incapaci di difendere i nostri diritti. Vogliono che siamo genitore 1,
In a lot less fun, quite depressing and horrific news, in August of 2022, as a campaign strategy, Giorgia Meloni shared a pixelated video on Twitter of a Ukrainian woman getting raped by an African immigrant in the street as she cried out for help. The victim of this horrific video has come out and condemned the action and said she was recognized by the video. Thankfully, the post was promptly deleted by Twitter, but just guess what Meloni's response was to this rightful critique of her actions. She accused the other politicians of not condemning the rape itself. In terms of policies the new government has implemented, they removed all mandates for COVID-19 vaccination certificates and has already begun some early far-right policies like banning illegal parties and rallies, which was marketed as a measure against illegal raves, but could actually be used to apply force to any gathering the government deemed dangerous. That obviously gave them a lot of critique from the opposition and spawned a lot of protests. Meloni, in another controversial move, introduced a law to stop the Italian migrant boat crisis. You may ask yourself, why is this controversial? Well, because the law was about charity boats. You know, the boats that help people drowning in the water. She is of course not a big fan of them and has called them a de facto taxi service for migrants. In the law, she wanted to limit the time rescue boats are allowed to stay on the sea and force them to dock at distant ports, which has increased the time and cost of their missions. And no matter what side you are on the immigrant crisis, this is batshit crazy. It's one thing to not want immigrants in your country. It's a completely different thing to stop the boats that are one of their only lifelines from rescuing them when accidents happen, dooming hundreds if not thousands to die because of the crime of wanting a better life. This has already happened. At the coast of Calabria, an immigrant boat with about 200 people on board sank. 94 died, 34 of which was children. Thankfully, a lot of immigrants was saved, but next time they may not be as lucky. Overall, 20,000 immigrants have died in the crossing from North Africa to Italy. The government, like all Italian coalitions, has already begun to eat each other alive. This has primarily come from our favorite orange man, Berlusconi, less than a month after the election, where he described Meloni as patronizing, overbearing, arrogant and offensive. No matter our opinion of orange men in politics, you must admit they have some hits now and again. There is other influential political parties in Italy that I will now go over. Let's start with the orange man of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, and his party, Forza Italia. Currently they have 18 seats in the Senate and 44 in the deputies, which makes them by a large margin the third largest party of the right in Italy. Compared to the two parties bigger than them, Lega Nord and Brothers of Italy, Forza Italia is a much more traditional conservative and liberal party. And if any Americans are watching this video, when I'm saying liberal, I mean libertarian, which is surprisingly, to absolutely nobody except America, a right-wing ideology. Sorry about that. Let's get on with Forza Italia. As said, it was formed in the middle of the Clean Hands scandal, and was in the beginning one of the first modern populist parties. Now it has settled into a much more traditional role of the dominant center-right party of Italy. It has some fun quirks, like on social issues. Here, Forza Italia lets its members vote whatever they like, but almost every single member is conservative anyway. And it's not like European socially conservative, but American socially conservative. It considers marriage a union between a man and a woman, even though Berlusconi supported gay marriage in 2014. It is also against abortions and is highly critical of so-called gender studies. Economically, it supports privatization and less government, like for example a flat tax proposal, which doesn't make sense because their leader doesn't pay them anyways. Up top for Swiss banks. In terms of foreign policy, they are not that interesting. They support the EU but are also critical of them, and supports closer relations with the US. Surprise, Berlusconi and American politicians are like two peas in a pond. When writing this video, Berlusconi unfortunately died at age 86. He gave us all some great laughs, and for that reason alone he will most certainly be missed. No matter what you thought about him, he was certainly the cornerstone that defined Italian politics since his political debut in the 1990s. Now the future of Forza Italia is uncertain, but will probably be about the same, just a little less fun and corrupt. Lega Nord used to be a separatist populist movement of northern Italy, but now they have transformed themselves into something a lot more modern, the most far-right party in Italy. This transformation has happened mostly under one man's leadership, Matteo Salvini, or as his supporters call him, the Captain. He became the party leader in 2013 and has been a prominent figure ever since. Currently he is the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, which is like the Vice President. The party overall won big in the 2022 election, where they won 66 seats in the deputies and 30 in the Senate. Still a far cry from where they were in 2019, where they looked like they would get 39% of the vote, which would have made them the biggest party in parliament by quite a large margin. But in general, the Brothers of Italy have stolen their thunder, and they have lost a big part of their voter base to them, which is extremely cruel when they have so much in common. let's have a moment of silence for far-right infighting, and let's hope for more of it. But still, they are the second largest party in the right-wing coalition and the third biggest overall in the parliament, which is nothing to scoff at. Now let's look at their policies. Like most far-right parties, one of their main selling points is immigration. They want to be as hard against immigration as possible. So hard that their leader, Salvini, didn't just go to trial once, but twice for kidnapping illegal immigrants. And while I like to hate on far-right politicians as much as the next guy, I think this is overblown. The case was that Salvini didn't let rescue ships dock in Italy, and like if that's kidnapping, then every far-right European party is kidnapping illegal immigrants. Oh wait. One of the quirks of the party is that they don't just discriminate against Jews or immigrants, but also entire regions of their own countries. Because Salvini and many other members have been described as having a famous anti-Southern Italian stance, like wanting laws that prevented Southern Italians from moving to the northern part of the country and calling them welfare abusers and criminals, which is quite crazy. They are in general socially conservative, like being pro-family, sometimes anti-LGBT, depends on the member, anti-abortion and pro-Catholic. In the economic side, they are also quite libertarian, with them recently proposing a flat 15% tax for all, which is absurd and would make Italy one of the lowest tax-paying countries in the world. In foreign policy, they go to some interesting places. Their leader, Salvini, has proposed an economic opening to North Korea, and again was a big fan of Putin before the incident. He has met Donald Trump multiple times, like just look at this cute picture of them together. Funnily enough, the party never really had a pro-American stance, like many other far-right parties, and have opposed multiple invasions of the US, but it does really like the federalist system of the US and wishes to bring it to Italy. The Five Star Movement was founded by Beppe Grillo in 2009, who is an Italian comedian. It started as a populist movement that was anti-corruption, anti-establishment, and advocated for direct democracy, in which the people of a certain nation vote directly for policy. It also had a traditional anti-EU stance, which is not surprising, but has increasingly leaned off it since. In 2017, Beppe Grillo lost control of the party, when in an online poll he lost leadership 88% to 12% against Luigi Di Maio. Right now they hold 52 seats in the deputies and 28 in the Senate, making them the fourth biggest party in Italy. Before the 2022 election, they were the largest party by a 13% margin, and were the leading member of both of their coalitions with the Democratic Party and Lega Nord. Their leader is Giuseppe Conte, who was before 2018 a pretty much unknown law professor, until he got the call from the Five Star Movement to be the prime minister candidate. Now he is the leader of their party and is a popular politician by Italian standards. The one area that really destroyed him was his extreme COVID lockdown measures that eventually slew him in 2021, when he got replaced by Super Mario. In terms of policy, the Five Star Movement is like a kid with bipolar disorder. They really don't know what they want to be. They have very left-wing policies, like universal basic income and other left-wing economic bills. They are also supporters of gay marriage, which is again still illegal in Italy. But at the same time, they also support a lot of right-wing policies, like being very anti-immigration and being EU skeptics. This has resulted in them not being willing to form an alliance with pretty much anyone, except when they were forced to in 2018, where they won the election. Right now, they sit outside of the left and right-wing blocs, but it's hard to imagine them working together with the right, because they have tried and it didn't go great. Also, they have started to lean back on their anti-immigration stance, and even claim to be further left than the biggest left-wing party in PD or the Democratic Party. This all leads to them most likely trying in the next election to form government again with the Democratic Party, which they seem to have a much better relationship with, even when their relationship currently is on the rocks. Lastly, there is the Democratic Party. It's the second biggest party in Italy with 69 seats in the deputies and 40 in the Senate. They formed in 2009 as a big tent left-wing party, with 7 left-wing parties banding together to form it. Through the years, it has included more and more left-wing parties under its wing, and has since its formation been the primary left-wing party in Italy. In March 2023, Elise Line got elected as their party leader, so she is not as well known as the other political leaders in Italy. She is Jewish, bisexual, a woman and a global citizen, which is just an unfortunate thing to be in Italy, and she has already faced a lot of harassment and vandalism because of her origin and, quote, Jewish nose. She has been accused of being an agent of George Soros, and her sister's car already got vandalized, which prompted the Prime Minister Meloni to say she was very concerned, but Meloni herself has talked about the exact same thing, so...
Genitore 1, genitore 2, genitore 1, genitore 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2. Sono Giorgia, sono una donna, sono una madre, sono cristiana. Giorgia, sono una donna.
As said, we don't actually know too much about Elise Line, but from reading some of her interviews she has given, I can say a few things. If you could compare her to a well-known American politician, it would be AOC. She's a major supporter of the progressive movement, and it seems her main selling points are feminism, the environment, and LGBT rights. She is also the direct opposite of Joanna Meloni, and those two have gone back and forth quite a lot. Meloni has been deeply concerned with Sline's ideology, and Slines have accused Meloni of being a fake feminist. But the biggest crime of all is that in a New York Times interview, Slines criticized the absolutely iconic catchphrase of Meloni. I'm Joanna, I am a woman, I am a mother, and I am Christian. Here she said that I am a woman, I love another woman, I am not a mother, but I'm not less of a woman for this, which is a big L, because you can't be more of a woman than this.
Occupa del più debole. Giorgia! LGBT è il gioco. Giorgia! Omosessuale è il loro gioco. Giorgia! Cristiana! Giorgia!
Her leadership has also caused controversy, with prominent members like ex-cabinet minister Giuseppe Flioni leaving the party because of her win. It has yet to be seen what the Democratic Party will become under her leadership, but times will tell. In terms of the Democratic Party as a whole, it's difficult to describe them, because as said, they are a Big Tent party with a lot of ideologies. But if you had to describe them as an ideology, it would probably be as a social democratic party, which is a mixture of capitalist and socialist ideas. Their main selling points are being a pro-EU party, which you know there isn't a lot of in Italy, so they have kinda cornered the market. They are also a proponent of progressive taxation, pro-green energy, and progressivism, but not too progressive, as Slines has been criticized for being too progressive. They are one of the only parties supporting the export of weapons to Ukraine, but some have said that this may change because of their new pacifist leader. This would lead to the Brothers of Italy being the only party in favor of exporting weapons to Ukraine, which many left-leaning moderates thinks is a big issue. Their immigration stance have taken a bit of a more hardline approach since 2017. Before, they were one of the only pro-social integration parties in Italy. Their alliance with the Five Star Movement is also on the rocks, with them blaming the Five Star Movement for destroying Super Mario's coalition in 2022, But to be honest, I don't really see them allying with any other party, because the 5-Star Movement are really the only other left-wing party that is showing any lives in the polls. So the most likely path forward for them would be to get their alliance back with the 5-Star Movement if they want to form government in any future election. Who knows what Italy has in store for the next couple of years? But if we have learned anything from this video, it's that it will be chaotic. They have a lot of issues that needs fixing, but it seems that political direction is leaning more to the American side, where you don't talk about any real problems of the country and instead just see who can throw out more buzzwords. This could, of course, change tomorrow, but it's unlikely. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you want me to do more in the future. See you next time. I'm done.